So we would like to welcome Lily Bryan here, and she is going to talk to us about microbes and the immune system.
Yes.
Take it away.
Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I looked at microbes and the immune system. And basically, I chose this topic because growing up, I was always told that playing in the dirt and being outside and getting dirty was actually beneficial and it would help your immune system be stronger. And this idea kind of has stuck with me for a while. But I never really went into the literature to check my understanding. So it was a good opportunity for that. Oh. How do I go forward on this thing?
Try clicking the screen.
There we go. Great. Thank you. So my objective is to find out if there is a connection between exposure to microbes and enhancing your immune system. Great. So just a quick overview of the immune system. We just went over this in class, but we have the innate and then we have the adaptive immune system, which both react and respond to each other. And innate immunity is what you're born with, and it involves the non-specific defenses that are activated right when the pathogen comes in contact with the human or the host. And then we have the adaptive immune system, which is turned on by that innate immunity. And that one involves the building of the army, the making of the antibodies, and then designing a army and the memory cells. So basically, if that pathogen comes into contact with you, again, you're not going to have a second reaction. And there's been lots of research showing that a maladaptive or a manipulated immune system is connected to hypersensitivities. And hypersensitivities are what's going to lead to allergies and allergic reactions because your immune system is overreacting to a non-pathogenic microbe. Okay. Great. So at first I looked at cesarean sections versus vaginal births. And in the womb, the fetus is basically living in a sterile environment, protected by a lot of this amniotic fluid. And it's not until an actual birth when they're going to be getting their first dose of microbes. And there was a long-term research project that was done on over 2 million children. And their aim was to see if there was a connection between children born via a cesarean section with an increased likelihood of immune disorders. And what they ended up discovering was that children delivered through the vaginal canal were less likely to have a lot of these chronic immune disorders like allergies, asthma, inflammatory bowel syndrome, and etc. And all this research seemed pretty consistent. So I'm just going to be showing one research project per each of these ideas, just to keep this as brief as possible. Okay, great. And so why would this be the case? Why would exposure to vaginal microbes lead to a decrease in immune deficiencies? And basically what it looked like was that there's different types of microbes present that the fetus is actually going to be exposed to during a vaginal birth versus cesarean birth. And these unique variances in microbes are going to cause different strains or different species to take over and lead to distinct biotic colonies present that are going to be in that fetus. And there was a pretty good research article done that also brought into the idea that it could have to do with medicines that the mother's given before the cesarean section, which could also contribute to a different amount of microbes that are present during the cesarean section. So it all tends to agree that there is a correlation between cesarean sections and autoimmune disorders, but not exactly sure on why that would be. Great. Next, I looked at like growing up. So where you're growing up and what kind of location, and if that could have an influence on your immune system. And there was a ton of research on this topic. And what I ended up looking at a lot was farm life. And there was a great study done on farmers' children and their resistance to hay fever and asthma. And this research used over 1,307 students who filled out questionnaires over the course of 16 years. And what they discovered was that children of farmers had become adapted to these microbes that they were exposed to. So in other words, they were better adapted to deal with foreign non-pathogenic microbes. And this study points out that these kids were being constantly exposed to a large number of microbes, which caused a continuous stimulation of the immune system, which meant really high numbers of these T regulatory cells. Okay, and why are they going to have these high numbers? And basically, what I said before, they're constantly being exposed, which is going to cause the immune system to make higher numbers of these T regulatory cells. And these T regulatory cells are going to help your adaptive immune system build tolerance instead of overreacting, which happens a lot if you don't have these T regulatory cells. These basically cause your body to not endure a reaction, and they're going to build tolerance to maintain like this homeostasis of your immune system. Okay, great. And then next I looked at antibiotics, and I was basically looking at antibiotics and how that's going to affect your immune system. And there was also a lot of research on this topic. One great research project that I looked at was looking at a 5-day dose of oral ciprofloxacin, which is an antibiotic that's commonly used, and they used healthy volunteers. And the result was that after this 5-day dose, there was decreased richness, diversity, and abundance of microbes. And most notable was that after 4 weeks, some of the bacteria that had previously been present did not recover. Then they did this 7-day antibiotic, the same ciprofloxacin, and they discovered similar results, but that even up to 2 years, there was still a lot of this depletion of bacteria that was very helpful for the body. And then why is that important? So even though these antibiotics are generally pretty effective at terminating the target microbe, they also kill off a ton of really healthy microbes in your body. And this depletion of bacterial strains and species are shown to affect your immune system, especially when fighting viral infections. Other negative effects I list right here, there's like immune cell dysregulation, systemic immunity dysfunction, all of which are just going to disrupt your immune system, causing you to be more susceptible. And an area to zoom in on here is that the intestinal microbes and the immune cells are in constant communication with each other. And when antibiotics are used, these signals between them get much less reliable. And so let's say we have an antibiotic and it's supposed to be targeting some gram-negative bacteria. It's also going to kill off a lot of other of these gram-negative bacteria, which let's say are going to produce these peptides, which kill off some pathogenic gram-positive bacteria, which is basically a natural defense system. And so by killing off other bacteria, you're then going to be killing off ways that your body's naturally defending itself from other microbes that are trying to invade. So basically what I found is that birth methods, there's definitely a connection here. It seems like during a cesarean section, you are more likely afterwards to suffer from immunodeficiencies. But the reason why, there's no real consensus on that. Where you're growing up, farm life, it seems like the more exposure to microbes you have at a young age, the stronger your immune system and the less likely your body is to have hypersensitivities to non-pathogenic microbes. This is also the case if you have large families or have dogs or cats at your house. You're also less likely to have these allergies. And then antibiotics, super important, but they're also going to be getting rid of a lot of very beneficial microbes in your gut. And then I have my citations. So if anybody has questions or comments, please let me know.
Super interesting. I've also heard there's a link between birth method and the prevalence of IBS too. And I feel like that's for the same reasons we were talking about, even though it's on autoimmune disease, just like having that initial exposure to your mother's bacteria is important.
Totally, yeah. There seem to be tons of research on that one topic. I'm sure you could go like really deep into, exactly how and why that would be. Anyone else? Questions?
This is probably kind of random, but did they say anything that when it comes to the natural birth method of being in the hospital or being like in a water bath or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't get into that, but I'm sure there are research articles out there on that. Yeah, and that could totally have, to do with, sterile environments. If you're born into hospitals, more likely to have less microbes that you're encountering. Yeah. Okay.
Did you read any? Was there anything that you came across just with tendency to have so much antibacterial everything, like antibacterial soaps, antibacterial like shoes?
Yeah, I didn't look a ton into that, but similar things where you're just gonna, in that process, be killing off a lot of these other microbes that are gonna be, beneficial. And then, I don't think I mentioned this, that then you're gonna, create these super microbes that are able to evade a lot of these antibiotics, which, it's causing a lot of problems in hospitals and prescribing medications. But I didn't dive into that section of it.
All right.
Great, thank you.
So we can do, what is it like that? All right. No, thank you. That was very good. Thank you very much. Yeah, and I didn't talk so much about the bowel. We're talking about the colon, like it's just full of bacteria. Again, like half the mass of your poop is not wasted food. It's actually just the bacteria that are living there, and they play really important roles in your immune system and lots of other things. So yeah, thanks for kind of bringing that up a little bit here, so we could, because that is really interesting and important.
I have a quick question, actually, for, I guess, anyone. So I know you can take antibiotics and also take probiotics at the same time. How do the antibiotics not affect the probiotics that you're also taking at the same time? Because you're trying to like restore that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I looked a tiny bit into this, and basically, I don't know exactly how it works, but there is research out there saying that by taking probiotics right after or during the antibiotics, you're less likely to have these long-term effects of those depletion of certain bacteria, and probably because it's not meant to target those, or else you're overloading your body with tons of bacteria you're likely to keep a lot more than you would have before.
Yeah, I think I've heard that doing that also helps prevent yeast infections.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, yeah, we said like the antibiotics knocking out the lactobacillus create the more alkaline environment that lets the candida start to flourish. So if you could restore that lactobacillus, then you're going to avoid the yeast infection. Cool. All right, so thank you very much. And I guess it's probably time for Raina.
Cool, yeah. It's me and Brittany together, so let me share my screen with you all.
Raina Barrera Aguilar and Brittany Thompson. Together again.
One second here.
You guys, you're doing like birth control and depression?
Yes, exactly.
Here we go.
Cool, great. So, yep, as Dr. Egert says, Brittany and I took a look at hormonal contraception and depression, and we just really wanted to know, is there a link between the two? So I'll just briefly go over hormonal contraception, also known as birth control. So there's been a lot of advancements in birth control over the last few years. We've come a long way from just the latex condom and the pill once a day. So we now have more long-acting reversible contraceptive methods, otherwise known as LARCs, including like the implants and the IUDs. And they're pretty much available like anywhere in the world at this point. So, but with the increases in the usage of these, there's also been increases in concerns about the side effects, short-term and long-term, and especially, and how they affect mental health. And so in this presentation, you'll hear us talk about combined methods, which is methods that have both estrogen and progestin, which is the exogenous form of progesterone, or just progestin methods.
Estrogen and depression. Estrogen has a big impact on the brain and its behavior. It can be located in many places like the amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, which all have to do with emotion and emotional memory, as well as the prefrontal cortex, which has to do with behavior and personality. And it also manages the activity of major neurotransmitter systems, such as cholinergic, serotonergic, dopaminergic, and other receptors, as well as second messenger pathways that are all associated with pathophysiology of mood disorders. And it also does play a role in other systems that are related to mood disorders as well. And then
and then we found these tweets that we thought were just kind of funny, so I wanted to include them in here to kind of like show, the point that these are ideas that people do have, So this one person said, birth control be like, well, do you want depression or do you want a baby? And then this other one was like, I asked my gyno which birth control would not make me depressed. She said, unfortunately, there's just not a lot of data on birth control and its effects on mental health. I don't know. Remember when they abandoned male birth control research because it made dudes moody? We just thought that was funny. Okay, so progesterone and depression, friend or foe. So there was a study that was actually titled Friend or Foe. I just thought that was really funny. Progesterone, it's another sex hormone that has very similar roles to estrogen. It also is related to kind of the, these pathways that have to do with mood disorders in the brain. And the study referred to progesterone as a double-edged sword because they found that it helped relieve patients' symptoms of postpartum depression, but it exacerbated premenstrual syndrome symptoms. And during times of stress and stress responses, progesterone can be converted into cortisol, and cortisol is associated with mood-related disorders. And this graph right here shows the levels of progesterone throughout different stages. So if we see the menstrual cycle and in pregnancy, it rises up until partum, and contraception, it just kind of stays stable.
Premenstrual dysphoric disorder is a mental health disorder that is found within the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is also a more severe form of premenstrual syndrome that has many serious symptoms triggered before and during menstruation. The symptoms of PMDD begin in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle and must improve once menses begins and then completely subsides, usually a few days or a week after menstruation. Symptoms for this to be diagnosed, an individual is usually experiencing at least 5 of these common symptoms, such as markedly depressed mood, irritability, lethargy, hopelessness, anxiety, change in appetite, as well as some physical symptoms such as stomach bloating and breast tenderness.
Yeah. And so in our research that we found that birth control was actually used as a treatment for PMDD. In one study, they gave a combined pill to subjects that had estrogen and drospirenone, which is an anti-androgenic type of progestin. And so drospirenone is a testosterone antagonist. And elevated testosterone levels were found in the subjects who were experiencing PMS. So they thought that this was how that caused like kind of that protective factor against the symptoms because it didn't they prevented the testosterone from binding to receptors.
Evidence that hormonal contraception can help with depression. Along with natural estrogen found within the body that does associate with mood regulation, exogenous estrogen helps with positive mood regulation by way of cortisol responses. Results from salivary hormone testing in users of combined hormonal contraceptives showed greater cortisol binding globulin levels than in subjects who were non-compliant with the contraception use. This binding action actually reduces cortisol's effects in the body, which creates potentially protective properties for chronic stress in hormonal contraception users, which does help reduce overall risk of depression, mainly because stress is a main contributor to stress. But overall, unfortunately, there's not enough data on this, and the ones that do exist are very conclusive just because it does vary from person to person.
Exactly, yeah. And so now some evidence that birth control does contribute to depression. So in one study of 202 healthy subjects who were using a combined pill, they did actually report worsened mood in the time between their periods. And in those who had used birth control or hormonal birth control in the past, reported even more severe symptoms than the other subjects. In another study, they looked at subjects who had PTSD. And so they found that during times of high levels of progesterone in the body, they were actually more easily triggered. They had more PTSD triggers. And they also, in a different study, they found that hormonal contraceptives were associated with higher rates of initial prescription of antidepressants in a large study of 1 million subjects. So that study I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail because it's super fascinating. It is by far the most comprehensive and best designed study that exists on this topic. There were 1 million subjects ages 15 to 34, and they were followed for 14 years. And overall, the findings of this are that hormonal contraceptives were all associated with higher rates of prescription of antidepressants. And the methods that were the highest were progestin-only methods, such as the Depo-Provera injection or the shot, and the implant. But a potential confounding variable is that the start of a new sexual relationship or romantic relationship could be related to both contraceptive and antidepressant use.
Other factors that can contribute to depression in hormonal contraception users. There are multiple physical and emotional side effects of contraception that individually can lead to depression. Some of the physical side effects include an increase in blood pressure, which some studies have shown that long-term administration of hormonal contraception can possibly lead to a slight increase in systemic blood pressure, usually within adolescence, which can result in vascular diseases. So the helplessness of feeling like you have a really horrible disease could be a huge trigger to depression. Also, weight gain and acne are huge contributors to depression because of huge insecurities that people have to deal with. And then some emotional mental side effects can include stress from disapproval of use from parents or current partners. So again, a lot of times with teenagers who don't want to admit that they're sexually active. Fear of contraceptive failing and becoming pregnant, since the whole point of contraception is to not get pregnant. And then also more prevalence of stress in society in general.
Yeah. Great. So overall, the conclusions that we found were that progestin-only methods did tend to be associated with more negative emotions and mood problems than the combined methods with estrogen. But overall, really the results vary based on individuals and populations. Like we saw the stabilization of symptoms in those who already had PMDD or bad PMS, but worsening of mood observed in healthy subjects.
Challenges faced by researchers would be that data is collected through self-reported surveys and symptoms are a part of subjective experience, as well as many subjects that have negative expectations based on other women's experiences, which I can relate to because when I did the Nexoplan, I was very nervous and hesitant to take it because of a lot of the negative feedback I was getting from family members and other women that I have heard about this from, as well as some positive experiences as well. Controlling for pre-existing physical and mental health conditions, which is not always easy, including like PTSD, as we discussed earlier, depression, as well as anxiety. And then lastly, correlations versus causation and many possibilities for confounding variables, which can definitely have misleading results for you. But overall, we did basically find that it was very inconclusive because it does, again, vary between person to person. So some side effects definitely do contribute to depression, whereas some do not.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think overall, this just kind of speaks to more of the point, of like the studies, the things that we were doing in our labs, looking at the nervous system, how just really individuals have different sensitivities and people's, nervous systems and their bodies are different. So they're going to respond to medications differently. So there's huge potential for research here in the future, for sure. A lot more really needs to be done. And that is it.
Cool.
Any questions?
There's so much to say. I'm sorry if we were going a little bit fast. Like, there's a lot. So
Yeah, we had to actually delete some stuff because there's just so much to say.
I had a question. So you had talked about blood pressure increasing when they were taking. Is there any research on after they stopped taking it? Does the blood pressure go back down, or what did you?
They didn't really go into detail since it wasn't part of the main study, but they did say that it's actually, they did say vitamin D and blood pressure are two things that they think that you could go further in depth in research and study to actually see if there is an association between that and depression. But yeah, they didn't go any further really than that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that when patients get counseled about them, they're told that like those symptoms should go away when they stop using.
One of the interesting, like that thing you were talking about, why there is not as much research into male contraception. It's an interesting thing. It's like whenever there's a new med, you have to look at what are the side effects and how are those weighed out against the benefits. And birth control, hormonal birth control has a lot of negative side effects, but your chance of dying in childbirth is actually pretty high as well. So when they're trying to say like, is this something we should approve? They say, well, it's got a lot of side effects, but it's keeping you from this other thing, which also is really bad. But for guys, the side effects of not getting your partner pregnant or getting them pregnant, on the pure health of the guy is like zero. So like you have any kind of side effects for the male contraception become like way magnified, as opposed to like, well, if he's not taking it, then he's not going to get pregnant. So it's that's my understanding. Part of the reason why male contraception is not something that has been developed is more of that reason, which is
Yeah, like it really is kind of like you have to like really see if the side effects of it outweigh the benefits for you, because when I was a medical assistant at Planned Parenthood for a while. So I have a lot of background on this, and if anybody ever wants to talk to me about my experience there, I'm totally open. But when we would counsel patients, we would show them the side effects and they would get really freaked out. And then it's like, well, yeah, but did you know your, chance of getting a stroke during pregnancy is like, like tenfold higher than, taking these pills. So, yeah.
Right. And having to raise a kid when you're 16, is that what you want to do? That's also going to probably cause depression if you weren't wanting that path. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it gets tricky. So, any other questions for Brittany and Raina? All right. Well, thank you for that. That's also, again, I think, and this is the kind of stuff I think that's probably interesting for, not just for you who did the research, but for other people who are trying to make decisions. And, unfortunately for some of these topics, you realize that the answers are not clear. You kind of wish there was more of a obvious answer, but it's, but at least it gives you more information to make informed choices about your life. So yeah, thank you for doing that and presenting that.
No problem. Thanks, y'all.
All right, so now who else? Next one was Raina. Grace says, I'll go.
Yep. Okay. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So I looked at ketamine as a treatment for depression. I had only heard of ketamine as like Special K and sort of like an illicit substance growing up. And then more recently, I heard of it being used by like paramedics or in the emergency room. And then even more recently, I heard of someone using the nasal spray to treat depression. So that is sort of like what helped me decide on this topic. And then so Ketamine is considered a dissociative anesthetic drug. It's a racemic mixture, and it refers to the two optical stereoisomers, S-ketamine and R-ketamine. It's an N-methyl D-aspartate receptor antagonist, and it works by blocking the glutamatergic receptors. And glutamate is an important neurotransmitter usually involved in excitatory pathways. And so it's considered an NMDA receptor antagonist because that's what it has like the highest affinity to. But some of the research that I looked at shows that it's, like attracted to other receptors too, and that might play a role in what makes it a good antidepressant option. And then it also exerts analgesic, anti-inflammatory, and antidepressant actions. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to read like a couple of these. So it was first synthesized in 1962 at the Parke-Davis Pharmaceutical Company following the discovery of phencyclidine, which is PCP. And its first clinical use was in Belgium in 1963 as a veterinary anesthetic. So they basically synthesized it with the hope of it, having less side effects than PCP. And then because it had some similar potential to anesthetics and it was less causative of delirium, it was selected for human trials in 1964. And then in 1970, Ketalar emerged as the first sample of ketamine approved by the FDA for use by humans. And then it has a lot of different therapeutic applications, and it's considered nearly ideal due to its ability to maintain homeostasis, cardiovascular stability, and respiratory reflexes. And then in 2000 was the first placebo-controlled study that suggested ketamine had antidepressant actions. And that finding was later replicated in 2006 in a double-blind placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial. And then in 2019, intranasal S-ketamine spray was approved by the FDA it's like an adjunct treatment to a standard antidepressant treatment in a supervised setting. So some depression and like traditional antidepressant facts. So depression affects around 16% of the world population at some point in their lives. There are currently 350 million individuals suffering from depression worldwide, and it's the third leading cause of disability in the world. So with the traditional monoaminergic-based antidepressant treatments, they require several weeks, if not months, to respond, the patients do. And some patients never attain sustained remission of their symptoms. And that lag in the onset of antidepressant action has been associated with increased risk for suicidal behavior. And then treatment resistance concerns affect 1/3 of patients who fail to achieve recovery. And some symptoms of depression are low mood, low energy, decreased productivity, strained interpersonal relationships, sadness, feelings of guilt, lack of motivation, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. So some of the benefits that they've seen to use ketamine to treat depression is that it's fast acting. That's like, one of the main benefits over traditional antidepressants. One study found that single dose administration is associated with immediate antidepressant effects. And sometimes in some of the trials, it showed that antidepressant effects of ketamine are sustained for up to 1 to 2 weeks. And it was proven effective in patients with treatment-resistant depression. So some of the trials with those patients define treatment-resistant depression as having tried 2 or more traditional antidepressant therapies, and another one had people that had tried up to 6. And then it's demonstrated rapid and robust efficiency as an antidepressant by improving core depressive symptoms, including depressed mood and suicidal thoughts. So ketamine is water and lipid soluble, so that makes it
possible to be administered a lot of different ways. The optimal route is IV, but that's not always achievable in emergencies or children or obese patients. And there have been improvements in obtaining intraosseous access, so that's become a more efficient route. And then intramuscular has been used for decades. It's safe and predictable, but it's painful upon injection. And compared to IV, it's associated with a longer recovery and a higher rate of vomiting. And then the oral bioavailability of ketamine is pretty low, so that's not a great option. And then intranasal administration is also an option. And due to the rapid systemic absorption and the ease of access, it makes this route pretty appealing. So this is S-ketamine, which is the nasal spray. So scientists at Janssen reasoned that S-ketamine was the active ingredient. So they made like a pure form of S-ketamine to deliver more of the drug to the nasal passage. They manufactured the drug, calling it S-ketamine, and subsequent trials demonstrated that when delivered intranasally, it had robust antidepressant effects in patients with treatment-resistant depression. And it was granted FDA approval in March 2019. So, like a lot of the research and trials I saw talked about like they kind of consider them negative side effects, but other people think that maybe these like dissociative side effects are what kind of play a role in the antidepressant action. So there are dose-dependent drawbacks such as dizziness, nausea, vomiting, and hypersalivation. And then the ketamine-induced psychological dissociation is characterized by altered feelings and perceptions, including auditory and visual delusions. And the study that I found that in was stated that those side effects came from doses that were greater than a sub-anesthetic amount. I think it was like 4 times that. And then it also provokes imaginative and dissociative states and psychotic symptoms resembling schizophrenia due to its NMDA antagonist action. So then to kind of piggyback on that, some of the arguments against ketamine are its abuse and dependence potential. You know, some of those side effects are negative, and I think other people would argue that they are a positive, and that's why people, you know, use it recreationally. The DEA still considers it a Schedule III controlled substance. It has been used to facilitate sexual assault. Higher doses of ketamine trigger schizophrenia-associated symptoms, including changed perceptions. A drawback of it being given intravenously is that it needs to be administered in a doctor's office, which limits its clinical application. And then its efficacy and safety still needs to be further researched. There are still a lot of unknowns about how it works, how safe it is in the long term. You know, is it safe for people who have like previous mental illness? Yeah, and that's the end.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anybody have questions for Grace?
Yeah, I have a question. So you had talked about that the best route was that through IV. Was there any research on why that may be, or do you know why that is?
They didn't explicitly say. I think most of the trials that they like, it's been used IV since like the 60s or 70s. So I think the most information they have about that is IV, but also, you know, it's going straight into your bloodstream essentially. So I would imagine you're going to get like better results, but I think you're also going to get some more side effects that way too.
Great.
I mean, and I mean, so I'm actually the guy, one of the guys that's the collaborator on the MDMA work is one of the main persons who pushed forward all this I mean, the ketamine work. So I know a lot about this stuff, and they do IV, but it's very common to do IM. And even though it doesn't have good oral absorption, they make these little troches. They just put it in this like kind of waxy stuff you put it under your tongue, and you can absorb it. It's not as effective as giving yourself a shot, but it still gets into your body effectively enough to be useful for this kind of stuff. So there are, so IM is very common for administering ketamine, and it seems to be, I think probably if you're doing like a study and you want to know exactly how much is getting into the bloodstream, doing IV will give you, because but in terms of just practical administering, IM works fine.
I know they do like ketamine lollipops sometimes for pediatric cases and other things too.
Right. So, I mean, and that you have to kind of get it through the kind of oral mucosa, though. Like if you just swallow ketamine, it doesn't really, you're kind of wasting it. Um,
I have a question. So it seems like a lot of the controversy around ketamine is that it's also an illicit substance. So when you go into the doctor's office, are they giving you like the same thing that you might find on the street in just like a lower dose? Or is it like a different chemical structure from the stuff that you would abuse? Or is it the same?
I didn't really look into like the street part of it. I looked at like a DEA fact sheet about it. I don't know. I think that what you're running into with getting something on the street is the potential for it to be like cut with something else. And then what you're getting at like the doctor's office will be kind of like a more pure form of it, I guess.
I mean, that's for sure. I mean, getting powder off from random people, you're never sure. In fact, more and more random stuff is getting cut, like with fentanyl and stuff like that, which will make you. But the stuff she did cover about the S-ketamine, that's kind of been an interesting thing because that company is trying to patent this thing that they're claiming is their version that's really effective, but there's no reason to think that S-ketamine versus the racemic mixture is, particularly way better or the only way to go by any means. And if you are getting just real ketamine, the ketamine that's used as recreational, just at very low doses, because I mean, Grace, what you were saying, subanesthetic would mean just you're not being completely like, being able to operate on. But some of the doses that they use for the therapy is pretty high. Like if you shoot somebody with like 100 mgs, they might not even know they're a human anymore. They might just be in some nether world of pulsing energy with the ancestors or something. But it's not quite, there's still a conscious narrative going on, so it's not quite anesthetic. So there's a whole range. And again, some people use it at very low doses. There's actually a study right now that's trying to figure out how much is there how much of the actual kind of non-ordinary experience is important for the antidepressant effect, and how much is it just a chemical thing, something about the way this molecule acts in your nervous system. So there's a study right now where they have, they're anesthetizing people. So they're having them completely unconscious and then infusing them with the ketamine so they can't have a actual conscious experience, but their nervous system is still getting suffused with the ketamine. And then they're going to compare those people to the people who are doing the therapy, but where they are having the kind of more psychedelic experience. Because, for a lot of the other psychedelic therapies, it actually is important that you're having an experience, that you're bringing something back and getting a new perspective from. So with ketamine, it's still kind of unclear if it's one or the other or some combination of them. So, oh, it's 5-2. But yeah, ketamine, it's what Grace was saying, having a way to get somebody off of the edge of, suiciding is really nice. And the only other thing we had really before that was like, ECT, putting somebody, electrical voltage across them to kind of instantly get them to be where you didn't have to worry about it so much. So it really is, it seems like it could be a really valuable addition to kind of mental health drugs. So at this point, I think, so for the rest of you all, we will hear from more of you on Thursday. And not Thursday, on Tuesday. So we'll have one more week. So next week we'll finish up with the endocrine and reproductive. We'll finish up our talks. And actually you'll end up doing your lab practical on Thursday. But otherwise, so thank you. All three of those were great. And I'm looking forward to more on Tuesday.